Okay, you're running.
All right, like so many of my stories, this one starts with a quote from somebody else. Seller's Market. Hermit whore in solemn cell, wearing out life's evening grey, smite thy bosom, sage, and tell what is bliss and which the way. Thus I spoke, and speaking sighed, scarce repressed that starting tear, when the smiling sage replied, "Come, my lad, and drink some beer." Samuel Johnson. "Barkeep!" shouted young Gary with the joy of a working man who had found his way to Friday night. "Beer for all! Beer for everyone! Fill every glass in the house!" Cheers went up from every table, booth, and corner of Mike Thorner's place, as well as from a few sections of open floor, the freezer in the kitchen, and from one especially large-eared lout stalled in the back corner of the privy. Young Gary, it seemed, had an itch to celebrate that day. Moreover, he had the wherewithal to cover his scratching. Upon inquiry made by more than one curious and grateful patron, it was discovered that the lad had just triumphed in some manner of business deal combining cell phones and video games with downloadable music and online poker. 2 minutes previous to his entering and announcing his lagresse, he had been walking down the street just outside, receiving the news on his phone. Suddenly finding his net worth some 900,000% improved, he naturally did what he had always wanted to do, walk into the nearest pub and buy a round for everyone. Now, as everyone toasted his good fortune with the warmth and good cheer which are, of course, so natural to those daily testing the endurance of their liver, God's unsung blessing to us all, young Gary admitted his surprise to finding so many noble Catholic freedom fighters in an Israeli bar. The truth was, when Mike had purchased the tavern from its former owner, Ira Birkenwald, he had at first thought to name it after himself, as had the well-esteemed Mr. B. But that big, and you have to be able to see the capital I, capital R, capital A, Ira's place hanging outside was too beloved by the city's besotted dynamiters, and he had not the heart to take it down, don't you know. Anyway, that story tickled young Gary's fancy, and he ordered another round for the house, bringing him a wealth of heartfelt cheer and well wishes not seen since Douglas O'Connor and Hermione Delfinfinger tied the knot on St. Patrick's Day, treating the entire neighborhood to a 76-keg reception where the food was bountiful, the liquor was endless, and it was all served by trained penguins in black bow ties, so help me St. Peter. Anyway, not to get sidetracked on you, as the lad of the moment reached for his own frosty mug, a voice cut through the chatter and general boisterousness, catching the attention of all like a dinner plate hurled at the priest's head during High Mass on Good Friday. "Mike Thorner, me good man," asked the attention-grabbing baritone, "on a day such as the one this lad has had, are you really thinking of merely serving him just another beer?" It was a challenge of the playful sort, but the challenger was anything but the playful type. Indeed, as his voice sounded, there was not a patron within the hallowed walls of Ira's that did not sense the beginning of what the scribes would most accurately call an event. "Just another beer!" The beefy, thick-armed, well-mustached Michael repeated the words with a shock reserved for mother superiors accused of pimping their nuns. Squinting one eye and fixing the other on the speaker, he growled, "The blessed hangnail of St. Wolfen Puffin's self, you say? All right, out with it. Just what kind of scurrilous shenanigan might you be building up this time, Darby?" Every layabout, goofball, and thimble rigger in the place sat up and took notice, for, no matter how much of the Lord's happy ferment they might have lubricated themselves with that day, if Darby was about to hold court, there would be meat for every boyo's retelling grill that night for sure. As the silence of anticipation settled over the tavern, Darby picked his disreputable self up with a casual motion, replying to Mike, "Ah, now. And sure, and any of your fine ales is good enough for most every moment a man can think of, and the angels would weep at the truth of it. Christening a son, launching a ship, celebrating the bringing down of a 14-point buck with nothing more than a 22, and a prayer to his supreme majesty above us all. Any of that which you keep on tap would be a kindness well accepted on any of those occasions, and 1,000 more." Heads nodded solemnly in agreement around the bar. Young Gary, entranced, turned to center his attention on the storyteller's remarkable voice and manner. He found the speaker most repellent sorta, sloppily put together sagging balloon of a man, festooned with a beard the color of dirty porridge, who moved with the grace of a basketball suffering a slow leak. "But now, this lad here, he's made his fortune this day, and whereas any beer will taste of ambrosia on his lips, don't you think you should be offering him the hat trick?" All eyes focused on Mike as if he were the second coming itself, or a 3-car pile-up along the side of the road. As the barkeep stared at Darby with a healthy mix of disdain and intrigue, All eyes shifted from him to young Gary as the lad asked, if you don't mind me asking, sir, I mean, outside of hockey, what's the hat trick? For several seconds, the optical orbs of those in Ira's did the skull shuffle boogie, bouncing within their skulls between Mike and Darby until the former finally pronounced, "All right, fine. You got him curious. Go on with you. Tell him." And at that moment, a great silent cheer was more felt than heard throughout the tavern as its regulars twisted and shifted themselves into their most comfortable positions. The heaving cesspool of a man known as Darby was about to tell a story of some sort, and that they knew would be a thing of beauty, always worth a soul's full attention. "Well," the storyteller began, brushing away some peanut crumbs from his vest, along with some cottage pie crust, a bit of dried pudding, a banana peel, 2 mice, and some leaves from the previous autumn. "I'm certain, me lad, you've heard the truism that we don't buy beer, we merely rent it." Heads around the bar nodded sagely in agreement. Young as he was, Gary knew the time-honored mantra as well. Expressing his acceptance of the theory, Darby continued, telling all, "Well, and sure you're all correct in going along with those insightful words. Once we've lubricated ourselves with a pint or 12, it's off to the head we must stagger. Perhaps to have a seat so as to contemplate the secrets of the universe, or to stand so as to take more direct action, as well as to play a hand of dive bomb or captain." It was true that Mike turned quite the blind eye to the fascist laws of New York City, and thus to those who had a cigarette or 10 in his place. "And of course, we all know what happens next. With a pull of the handle, without a second thought, we send our contribution to the watering of the world on its way out to the sea. And there, over the days and weeks and all, the golden explosion we've sent along its ways travels out to the ocean, where it mingles with and is absorbed by good King Neptune's wondrous domain." Taking a light pull of his own mug, Darby looked at the mug, made a face that relayed his feeling that what was inside was good enough, sigh, and then went on saying, "And of course, good Mother Nature then works her magic and dilutes our offering, removes all those nasty salts and what have you, and stirs and churns and whips up the frothy brine until all is pure and wonderful. And does she stop there? She does not. No, she blesses us further. And do you know how, son?" Gary shook his head eagerly, signaling not only his inability to answer the question, but his earnest desire to have the riddle made clear. With a nod and a smile of appreciation, Darby continued, "Why, she condenses and heats and broils the seas until they throw off great heaving clouds of moisture every day, every minute, like clockwork. As we feed the oceans and seas and lakes of the world, she thins them out, sending it back to us as rain and the gentle snows of winter. She provides for us, filling the dams, overrunning the reservoirs, making certain that every river, stream, and creek flows to capacity with the sweet, clean, fresh water we need." Darby let his pause hang just long enough, then looking around at those listening, as if surprised to find them waiting, he added, "Why, we're making more beer, don't you know?" Thunderous applause met his statement. Men and women, and even the hounds, scattered about, whooping, cheering, and barking their approval. Taking another sip of his own brew, Darby nodded his thanks, then said, "Anyway, it just so happens that every once in a while a man has such a perfectly wonderful moment when drinking one particular beer, that when he sends it on his way back to the gentle bosom of the generous earth, that the spirit of the moment stays with his offering, binds with it, as it were, clings to it through the diluting and the stirring and churning, rides along past the stage of frothy brine, off onto the condensing and heating and broiling, riding it back to the sky on those great clouds of moisture. It beams down on the world, biding its time, until finally it filters back down with the warm and loving rain, finally finding its way to some kind and knowing brewer who, if he's lucky, and we're luckier, my heavens, yes, brings it just gently and sweetly enough, all intact, into one single beer once more." Oh, all mouths hung open, all mugs sat still, fingers wrapped around handles, bodies frozen in anticipation. Oh, there were many around the bar, in the booths, piled in the corners, etc., dying to throw out the question which needed to be asked, but all knew it was young Gary's night, and so, as in the great times of old, when men more seasoned would stand back and let the young face a charging stag, or move in on a comely lass, so that night did the patrons of Iris hold ready, waiting until the man-child of the hour asked, "And so it's like a magic beer?" "Oh, magic scarce begins to describe it," replied Darby, his eyes locked on some faraway memory. "Now, these beers Oh, goodness, they aren't all that rare. God does reward we sinners now and again. Indeed, many a man, perhaps two or three, even in this very establishment, have been lucky enough to chance upon one of these most perfect of beverages. Good, huh? Ah, youngster, they slide right down, they do. Infused as they are with the joy and happiness of the last drink and brimming over with goodness, and not just goodness in waiting, but goodness coupled with desire, goodness locked arm in arm with need, the need to be released, to provide happiness, to live again in the mind of a happy drinker, to find solace by bringing peace. Oh, my, these sainted beers are more than good, lad. They're practically mystical. After a pause of several long and somber moments, Gary asked, And you've had one of these beers? 5 times. A hush fell over the crowd as all within drew a sharp breath. Looking around to one and all, nodding his head to answer their unspoken question, he said, Oh, yes. I've got the gift, don't you know? Let me walk through the doors of a distributor of fine spirits, and if there's a doubler, a can, bottle, or keg of foam within their walls, I'll feel it like a stroke of lightning or the harsh words of a grandmother. Don't doubt it, lad. When I say a doubler is on hand, I know. And what a splendiferous moment knocking back one of those fine brews is. Oh, indeed. Now, at this point, Darby made a dramatic pause, one the crowd felt would be followed by a rapt description of the joys of being the lucky recipient of a doubler. Instead, however, he threw back the last of the beer he was working on, licked his lips with a kind of sad melancholy, as if no regular beer would ever quench his thirst again, then wiped his foamy beard with his sleeve and said, Well, that's not what we're talking about now, is it? You asked not about a doubler, but a hat trick, and that's what I should be telling you about. And suddenly, if one had thought silence had settled on Iris previously, they had not experienced near enough quiet in their time. As realization of what Darby was about to explain filtered through the crowd, a blasting hush, a monumental subduement, one to rival that heard throughout the universe up until the moment when God first decided to go into the wholesale planet-building business, fell like a 16-ton safe on all, so heavy and all-pervasive it squeezed the squeaks from the floorboards. You see, lad, said Darby, his words giving all within the signal to start breathing once more, a doubler is a good and wonderful thing, and rare they are. But they're rare in the sense that good teachers are rare, or copies of Action Comics #1, fine food in an English pub. Everyone laughed at his last aside, and Darby apologized for such a low and untrue remark, which only made his audience laugh all the harder. Smiling coyly, the storyteller nodded once more to all, then said, But a hat trick. Now there's a moment where God decided that someone deserved 2 birthdays that year. As I'm sure you figured out all on your own, these blessed beverages happen when someone sends the remains of a doubler back to the bosom of the world, and somehow its joy and good fellowship and all else experienced is so break the laws of science, overwhelmingly fantastic, so effervescently bombarded with the love of man and the grace of the Almighty, that the impossible happens once more. You mean, oh, indeed I do, lad. That's when the angels weep their woe over not needing sustenance to keep their immortal fire bright. That's when hunger feels not so awful and death suddenly seems not so permanent, for only by knowing such need and loss can a being appreciate the overwhelming grace and beauty and delectable frosty goodness of His Supreme Majesty's greatest gift to us, the hat trick. Now, young Gary was certainly enthralled by Darby's story. The man possessed the most finely silvered tongue in all the city, possibly the hemisphere, but still, his tale was one which offered no proof. Worse over, the lad could see a sale being offered to him at that moment which had, for all the world, disappointment written all over it. Hoping to preemptively stave off any ill will within the tavern, he asked, And, you just happen to have one of these beers here, don't you? Oh, it's true, said Darby with a nod and a wink. Clever you are to realize it. And you're the one who found it, aren't you? Well, that I am, young sir. So, asked Gary, knowing he had found the weakness in the huckster's pitch he assumed was being hurled in his direction, why didn't you drink it when you first found it? Oh, don't think I didn't want to, answered the storyteller, his voice so filled with a mournful, saddened longing. Patrons peered over their shoulders, certain someone was about to ask for donations for starving African children any moment. But, well, the truth is, the night I came across it, my tab was approaching, what would the word be? Astronomical, Mike threw out with a dry and sour sound. As others chuckled politely, Darby added, "So I let it pass, making a wager with Michael there behind the bar instead over its eventual fate and that of my bill." "I think I get it," answered Gary, a certain bitterness creeping into the edges of his voice. "You want me to buy that beer?" sputtered Darby, flecks of spittle and a bit of old ham sandwich flying from his mouth. "And why, in the name of St. Mildred of the Divine Assumption, would I want you to do that?" Stalled young Gary, suddenly not so certain of his position. Confident only seconds earlier he was the victim of a gigantic con, being maneuvered into paying some kind of outlandish fee for an ordinary 12 ounces, he now backpedaled, offering weakly, I don't understand." "Oh, now, and of course you don't, youngster. Let me explain. You see, I could have just drunk the beer, and a fine and rapturous evening I would have had doing so, too. I mean, men have been known to commune with the angels after a hat trick. Oh, it's true, it's true. But with my fortunes so extended, I offered Mike a wager. I told him what I'd found and gave it over to him with this condition. We would wait for someone with the means to purchase it. I would then do my level best to explain what was at hand, and to do all in my power to facilitate the sale of it to that handy swell, in this case yourself." "But you don't want me to buy it." "Oh, heaven forbid." Smiling, Darby explained, "You see, my debt was wiped out by giving the hat trick back to Michael. The wager, however, is my way of getting it back." "Huh?" "I've done my part now, you see," said Darby. With a questioning look thrown at the barkeep, he asked, "Haven't I, Mike, me good man?" "I don't know," answered the barkeep. "Frankly, I don't think so." And just what do you mean by that, Michael Patrick Thorner? Does he believe?" "Oh, yes, good point, good point." Darby stared at young Gary, all the steam leaking out of him like a locomotive shot through both boiler and oven. Pulling his sorry self together despite a sudden crushing air of sadness, the storyteller said, "In my haste to reclaim what, in a moment of weakness, I released onto the seas of commerce, I forgot one fine point of our agreement. You see, yes, indeed, I had to do my level best to make the prospective buyer believe in the idea of the hat trick, and that one of these rare gifts from the Creator was present here. Now, my deal with Michael was that if I did so, and the prospective buyer did not then purchase the beer, I'd get it back. But they would have to turn down the offer, but still believe in it." His voice trembling, rheumy eyes quivering, Darby finished, "So, well, the question is, young Gary, do you believe?" All within Iris held their breath. Even the hounds on the floor lifted their heads, the passage of oxygen frozen in their muzzles as all stared at the lad, awaiting his answer. Somehow, finding enough moisture within his mouth to make all the parts of it work, Darby croaked out, "And so, that was our complete and entire wager, me boy. And if you don't mind me saying, why, you've been a fine audience, and a wonderful benefactor to us all here this night. If I was to see your backside heading for the door, why, I'd be the happiest greensman from here to County Cork." All eyes still on young Gary at that moment intensified their gaze. Unblinking, the 95-eyed monster, Billy O'Flynn was still wearing an eye patch from his run-in with mean Eddie McFadden, stared intently, no other item of business important as his at that moment. His mind turning over all he had heard, the back of his mind reminding him that he was, after all, his mind turning over all he had heard, the back of his mind reminding him that it was, after all, his lucky day. Young Gary finally said, "Could I see this beer?" Cheers and screams went up around the bar. Others just as immediately reminded those more excitable friends that he was only taking a look, and as the beer in question was pulled forth from the fridge below, all inside pressed forward to feast on the sight of it with a clean and covetous longing. "Oh, yes," laughed Darby, simply at the sight of the bottle, his eyes shining as if he had just heard from St. Peter that all his sins had been forgiven and that he'd been given a free pass on the next 16. What brand of malt beverage it was, of course, was of no importance. The taste of this beer was one for the soul and not the tongue. The bottle shown to young Gary was covered in ice, a fine glaze made of thousands upon thousands of perfect crystals, all shimmering in the low light there in the bar. Turning the frosty bottle over in his hands, he said, "Well, not much to look at, is it?" "Oh, no, not at all, not at all," said Darby, maybe a bit too quickly, with perhaps a tiny dash too much disingenuous in his voice. As if to cover his mistake, the storyteller suddenly turned his longing gaze from the bottle in the lad's hands, staring upward at the ceiling, moving his eyes to the moose head in the corner, looking anywhere except back at that which made his face flush and his eyes water. Gary turned the prize over several more times, then finally leaned forward to Mike and asked, "So, Well, just what are you asking for this prize? As Michael scribbled a figure on a bar napkin and slid it across to the young man, strong men wept in anticipation, none shedding more tears than Darby himself. The lad looked the paper over, moving his lips up and down, back and forth in consideration. All about him, men shook and women trembled, everyone within the walls of Ira's place practically bouncing out of their seats and off their stools with anxiety over the eventual outcome. Unable to take the strain, Darby closed his eyes, folding his hands and lifting his sightless face to heaven, and then, when the assembly could stand not another second, young Gary grinned and said, "Hey, why not?" Screams and cheers and the madness of a dam released rolled through the tavern, folks of all stripes slapping one another on the back, punching each other on the shoulder, and generally kicking up their heels. Without a word being said, the regulars who knew their way to the corner chairs rushed to their pipes and strings and drums, and in seconds music flowed. Women fell into men's arms, feet slammed against the floor, and the dogs yowled to witness the joy of it all. Young Gary handed Michael the check and then accepted his beer. When offered an opener, he answered almost shyly that he thought he might save it for later that night. It seemed there was a certain lass he wanted to share his news with, and that maybe he might share the hat trick as well. Hearing this, Darby said, "Ah, and there you go, stealing me misery over losing me bet by being so generous as that, and for love. Ah, youth, maybe it's not so wasted on the young after all." His eyes glistening, he bid the young man adieu, as did all the others within. Gary smiled, crossed to the door, then turned and simply nodded. Everyone understood, and then he and his beer were gone. For a long moment the magic of the past minutes hung in the air, fading slowly like the memory of one's most wondrous Christmas, until Darby's voice shattered the mood as he shouted, "All right, you heathens, pay up!" And all across Iris, folks exchanged tens and twenties and more, many of them crumpling their bills and hurling them at Darby's bloated, unwashed head. Catching them each and every one, the storyteller chided, "Bad sportsmanship doesn't keep it from spending, don't you know?" Mike Thorner merely stared at Darby, wondering first at how anyone could take advantage of others with such shocking lack of conscience, then reminding himself that this time he was an accessory to the crime. Oh well, he thought, how else was he ever going to collect Darby's bar bill? With a sigh, he slid young Gary's check into the register. He would make certain to cash it in the morning. Taking note of the somewhat sour look on the barkeep's face, Darby told him, "Ah, Michael, now have no worries. The lad, to be certain, he'll share his news and his beer, and his evening will be wonderful. And do you know why? No. Tell me. Because the human mind can circumvent all logic in service of self-deception. What good is all that money he made today? You can only eat so much bread and drink so much wine. Your bed can only be so soft, and your home can only hold so many rooms. But young Gary, he made an investment today. He bought himself a story, one he can tell friends and children and grandchildren for decades to come. He bought himself the envy of every man he'll ever know, and he'll send them all after El Dorados whose streets only he will have ever walked." The barkeep was about to make a rejoinder when suddenly the door slammed open, and in strode an excited-looking chap who shouted, "Drinks for everyone! I just hit the lottery!" And all around the tavern the crowd cheered and stamped and whistled. Music played and dogs danced, even as Michael checked his freezer for another appropriately looking ancient beer, and Darby muttered to himself, "This way to the egress, everyone." I'm not crying at my own wit. I forgot to put my glasses on. Thank you.